Trauma is an extremely heavy and existential topic for many people due to primarily their anecdotal experiences. However, it is very commonly applied to certain characters and stories because it amplifies the emotional impact of certain moments and it allows that character to become much deeper, much layered, and much more appealing to the reader. Life generally throws us difficulties and challenges regardless of who you are, where you come from, and other factors out of your control. But there are some events and some experiences that tend to stay with us forever in memory, and those experiences may sometimes be good experiences, or in very unfortunate cases they may be traumatizing experiences that you do not ever want to remember but are constantly burdened by. It could be displayed as things such as PTSD, overreaction to certain events, or sensitivity to certain sensations such as sound, images, and touch. Because of how realistic and abundant this trauma is in our lives, as unfortunate as it may seem, as well as due to how much it may resonate with certain people because of their experiences, as almost everyone has some kind of traumatic experience, or at least some kind of experience that they would not choose to go through had they had the opportunity to go back in time. Some are obviously worse than others, and some are obviously not that bad. Regardless of what your experience is, there are things that have held you back in your life and experiences that you do not ever want to think of. The addition of traumatized characters in stories becomes extremely compelling and impactful because of the emotional connection that it does create with the reader, as well as just the impact of many moments, the overcoming of this emotion, and finally defeating the trauma and freeing yourself from past experiences. In any fictional story that revolves around a problem or an issue that needs to be solved within the narrative, there are going to be fights, there is going to be adversarial conflict, and the main character or main characters will be or are going to be faced with obstacles such as villains, betrayal of friends, people that were once comrades, and at sometimes a lack of strength. These are obviously solved through pretty straightforward means such as overcoming the lack of strength by training, overcoming betrayal by defeating the one who betrayed you, and defeating the villain who is standing in your path from achieving your goal by simply confronting him in one way or another. Especially in anime and manga, I feel that these are very common problems, especially with the villains. There are many different villains in anime and manga that each have different kinds of goals, but in the end they are defeated or their goals fail to come into fruition due to the protagonist getting in their way and stopping them in some sort of conflict. It doesn't necessarily have to be physical all the time, but there is going to be some kind of conflict. To give an example of a conflict that is not necessarily physical, we have Monster. In Monster, Johan's conclusion is not a very physical conclusion. You can make the argument that there are physical elements to it, but more so what the conclusion to his character is sort of like a spiritual ending, and an ending that he himself chose for himself after coming to a grand realization. And an example, obviously, of a physical conclusion to a character, you can pretty much go and look at any other shonen manga out there. Let's just use Bleach as an example. Ichigo defeats. That is how you end the conflict with the main antagonist. However, there are conflicts that are much different from these physical interactions and encounters, and at times these obstacles and conflicts are much more difficult to defeat than the ones that relate to other people, specifically the antagonists or characters that are on the other side. So of course, it should be pretty well established. Let's take the character of Guts, who's pretty much the most traumatized character in all of manga. As we know, Guts has gone through some of the worst possible experiences a person can go through, and because of that he has developed a lot of trauma. This is made abundantly clear in the beginning of Berserk, as he does not let anyone lay a single finger on him before shouting at them at the top of his lungs. And this shouting itself is another example of his trauma, because had it not been for these traumatic experiences from the eclipse and from the past, especially due to his upbringing, Guts would not be this angered and would not be this emotional. A traumatized mind interprets certain situations to be more dangerous than actually are, because the body is trying to avoid once again falling into a very life-threatening situation, and so more extreme emotion is released from traumatized people in this situation so that they can escape the possibility of yet another life-threatening situation, even though it may not be nearly as dangerous as they perceive it to be, but they do perceive it to be so because of their traumatic experiences and because that's just how their body responds to trauma. Again, Guts shows a lot of emotion at the beginning of Berserk, but slowly starts to mellow down as the story progresses because he begins to overcome that trauma. And it is exactly overcoming that trauma that makes Guts such an appealing character, because it presents a different kind of conflict. It presents more of a self versus self conflict as opposed to something more like a self versus another person, or at times a self versus world conflict. Obviously, Guts has the conflict with Griffith, he has conflict with the apostles and the God Hand, but his biggest conflict is against himself and not allowing himself to be consumed. This is extremely appealing as we're not constantly chasing after something. We don't need to find the antagonist, we don't need to confront it, we are confronting it by the day. And by the moment, we're constantly against this adversary, and in Guts it is represented as the Beast of Darkness, and this Beast of Darkness presents itself as Guts' biggest enemy, and it is not another being, it is just simply something that has manifested itself from Guts' own trauma, and that is such brilliance because it is due to Guts' own experiences, not by his own choice, but by the choice of destiny and fate, especially in a story like Berserk, that has burdened him with these difficulties and has forced him to struggle forward to overcome them. It is a massive battle for the character to go through, but through emotional resistance and resilience and development of the character in general, changing in attitude, changing in desires and motivations, the character will eventually overcome that conflict. And that connection that has been tied with the reader becomes even stronger, as once the character overcomes that traumatic experience, it inspires the reader to also overcome their own, and it inspires the reader to continue struggling forward and to defeat their own conflict. I'm pretty sure none of us can really relate to chasing down dragons and beating down characters like Aizen or Madara, but I think we can relate to having gone through experiences and relationships that have just changed us completely, and certain experiences that have stayed with us throughout our entire lives. Seeing these characters go through similar experiences, while some may not be entirely similar, seeing them overcome their own traumatic experiences, whether they are similar or not to our own, allows us to be inspired to change our own, and teaches us that it is possible to live a life free from our past experiences and to live a life in peace without having to worry about further trauma and further suffering. The realistic element of trauma obviously can't go unnoticed either, because it reveals to us the other side of the character, unveiling possible personas and revealing more about the character's past experiences. It's that layer of mystery we get to understand, as well as Guts, again using him as an example, has that layer of mystery throughout the story as well, especially in the first arc of the story. And once the motivations and the reasons for certain actions are revealed, it makes so much more sense. And again, that connection with trauma is created between the reader and the character. Reader-character connections are extremely powerful and create some of the most emotionally impactful moments in the story. Take, for example, the eclipse. Again, take, for example, in the recent chapter of Berserk, Casca being taken away by Griffith once again. And to touch back on the inspiration aspect of the whole video, as people find inspiration in characters who overcome their own trauma, I think it's safe to say that a lot of people have found inspiration in Guts' character, and this is primarily the reason why. Because he struggles forward and he overcomes his own obstacles before going after other obstacles such as Griffith. From a narrative standpoint, which is probably the most important reason, the trauma that a character experiences pushes them forward, also amongst other reasons. Again, to use Guts, his trauma drives him into anger and into developing the Beast of Darkness, and the Beast of Darkness becomes Guts' biggest problem throughout the story. Overcoming that is huge, but the Beast of Darkness is also what pushes Guts to pursue Griffith, which is primarily Berserk's narrative, and it is Guts' responsibility to decide which pathway to choose. There is a lot of psychoanalysis behind the actual use of trauma and behind what actually causes our trauma, but that will make this video extremely long, and I think I have shared my point enough in this video. I hope you can now understand the impact and importance of trauma in storytelling, because it is so important and so crucial to creating compelling characters and creating that emotional connection between the reader and the character. Hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, I'm glad you did. That's it for me. Take care.